Okay, welcome, welcome. It's so nice to see everyone joining us here. We have an excellent presentation today, so we want to hurry up and get started to make sure we have plenty of time for our presenter to share his amazing work. Welcome to Sustainable Solutions, Reflections for the Next Generation. We are so happy to be able to offer this speaker series through the advanced academic program at Johns Hopkins University. My name is Dr. Cassandra Hansen, and I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Jen DeRosa, and we are both instructors within the environmental science and policy program, as well as Jen is the energy policy and climate program at Hopkins. And really the focus behind the speaker series is to bring practitioners that are tackling the wicked environmental, energy, climate problems and sharing what they're doing in the world. And we're just so ecstatic to have one of our very own instructors to be sharing with us his amazing work. But before I get started, I want to give everyone an opportunity to say hello to our presenter today, Dr. David Guggenheim. If you could just go ahead in the chat window, say hi, where you're coming from in the world, that'd be fabulous. And just a reminder, I know many of you will have questions. So if you have questions, please put your questions in the Q&A tab, and we'll be able to, Dr. DeRosa will be giving voice to your questions at the end of the speaker's presentation. So again, welcome for joining us today. So I am so pleased and excited to introduce today's guest speaker. Like I said before, he is one of Johns Hopkins' very own instructors. So please welcome Dr. David Guggenheim to our session today. Dr. Guggenheim is a marine scientist, conservation policy specialist, ocean explorer, submarine pilot, author, and educator. And he is founder and president of the Washington, D.C. based nonprofit organization, Ocean Doctor. And he is dedicated, this organization is dedicated to advancing the conservation of the world's ocean through scientific research, education, and community engagement. And as I mentioned before, we're so thrilled to have him be a part of the Hopkins family. And he is an instructor that teaches ocean stewardship and sustainability. And he will be offering his very popular course this spring. Dr. Guggenheim is going to be sharing with us his work that he's done in Cuba, and he's been going and doing this research for over the last 20 years, leading collaborative research and conservation efforts in Cuba focused on coral reef ecosystems. And he's going to be sharing with us his book that was just recently launched, titled The Remarkable Reefs of Cuba, Hopeful Stories from the Ocean Doctor. And this book details his 2 decades of experiences in Cuba, working in collaboration with Cuban scientists to explore the country's unique underwater ecosystem and understand why the world has lost half of its coral reefs while they continue to thrive in Cuba. So as an ocean explorer, Dr. Guggenheim piloted the first marine submersible dive into the world's largest underwater canyons located in Alaska's Bering Sea. He was inducted into the Explorers Club as a National Fellow in 2008. And his 2013 documentary, Disaster at Nightingale, details the dangerous oil spill, disastrous oil spill that occurred in a remote island group in the South Atlantic that killed thousands of penguins. As you will see from today, he's an accomplished speaker. He's been traveling around the country speaking as keynote speaker to various universities. And so again, we're so pleased to have him here. You may recognize him. He has been featured on 60 Minutes, Good Morning America, CNN, MSNBC, PBS NewsHour, and NPR, as well as other media sources. He is, again, a true educator, conservationist, scientist, and I just want to make sure that we give him a very warm round of applause for being here today. Thank you so much. And we're honored to have you here, and we look forward to hearing about everything that you are doing. So at this point in time, I'm going to offer you to share your screen. And again, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. I saw people from all over the world, from Tel Aviv to the Florida Keys. Thank you everyone for being here. A special thanks to you, Dr. Hansen and Dr. DeRosa, and of course, Dr. Huggins. I have to say, my ability to be here at Johns Hopkins has been extraordinarily rewarding. I'm learning as much, if not more, from my students than they are from me. And they certainly keep me on the toes. It's an amazing institution. All right, well, let's get started. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get off to the races. I hope you can see my screen at this point. I just want to thank my students. Let's see, once again, I'm having trouble. There they are. For showing up at the book launch. They dominated the crowd, and I've been on a book tour. I guess maybe this is part of that book tour as well. And it's been, you know, a bit of a painful birth, giving birth to a book, but it's also been quite rewarding. And I want to walk you through some of the main features of the book today. But first, we have to get into the mood. So here's a little video I put together. Well, it really makes me miss Cuba and diving. I haven't been in the water since before COVID, so I think I'm due, and I think we're all due. So why Cuba? Why bother to work in Cuba? Sometimes neighbors don't get along so well, but we are neighbors, and if something goes wrong in the neighborhood, we've just like on our own streets, we've got to find ways to work together to take care of the neighborhood. Yes, that's Buckingham Palace. Getting to Cuba in the old days was a real pain. We often went through third countries. I would often go through Mexico. There would always be flight delays. And one night after 20 hours of traveling, and still not in Cuba, reading from the book, I realized that I could have flown from DC to Heathrow, grabbed the Heathrow Express into London, made my way to Buckingham Palace, had tea with the Queen, rest her soul, and returned to DC in less time than to travel to a country just 90 miles away from the US. And to be conservative, I calculated that my tea with the Queen would not include scones and biscuits, just the tea. But it's difficult, and yet it's important because there are important connections. If you look at the flow of these drifters, you can see very clearly, very strong currents connect us. And many animals and fish use these currents. Larvae from fish, such as this grouper, are viable during that journey. So you could say Cuban fish grow up to be American fish. We're downstream. We depend on Cuba. And if we want to protect sea turtles and other marine species, sea turtles nest in American beaches and forage in Cuban waters and vice versa. So we are very much connected to each other. Our work has focused with the University of Havana, and this is the Center for Marine Research. And we planned a set of expeditions off the Gulf of Mexico coast, which had never been explored before. This is their good boat. The other boat has been at the bottom of a river for about 25 years. And this boat has a ferro-cement hull, which means basically it's made out of rock. It's concrete. Okay in shallow and calm waters, not so good in the rough waters of the Gulf of Mexico. So we were going to need a bigger boat. Now, to get that boat, in Cuba, there aren't many boats. Cubans on boats is not such a good thing in the mind of the Cubans. So I had to go to this guy. Comandante de la Revolución means he fought with Fidel during the revolution. I brought an interpreter because my Spanish wasn't so good at that point. And I realized to my horror that my interpreter was a low talker. If you watch Seinfeld, you kind of know what I mean. You couldn't hear him, so I had to speak in Spanish. And the comandante put his hand up as I'm just getting started, and he goes, "Momento, ¿cómo es posible un gringo de Washington, D.C. está aquí en mi oficina hablando español perfectamente? How is it possible that a gringo from D.C. is in my office speaking Spanish perfectly?" I was so relieved. We became unlikely allies when it came to the environment, and we got to use his boat for 10 years of expeditions. And again, this was exploring previously unknown areas of the Gulf. We produced the first ecosystem maps of the Gulf of Mexico in Cuba, but it really brought to the foreground a recurring theme. There's a lack of basic research in Cuba because of largely to the economy. In the process, we helped train the next generation of Cuban scientists. If you're going to be a marine biologist, it's kind of important to get out on the water. The woman in the foreground, Patricia Gonzalez, eventually became the head of the Center for Marine Research, our partner. A brief sojourn to Alaska. Yes, we're still talking about Cuba, but I went with Greenpeace to the Bering Sea to explore the two largest underwater canyons, actually the two largest canyons of any kind in the world, which are at the bottom of the Bering Sea, including Jemchug Canyon, which is much larger than the Grand Canyon. And we would take subs to about 2,000 feet. And what would be the last thing you'd expect to see down there in the depth? Beautiful, bright, pink corals. We now understand that cold water corals are around the world. And corals are the oldest living animal on the planet. They can live up to 4,000 years old, which means they're witness to the birth of the Bronze Age, the completion of Stonehenge, the reign of the pharaohs of Egypt, the birth of Christ, and the finale of Breaking Bad. That's an old animal. And just beautiful. And what you see is corals creating habitat for other creatures, especially fish. Here's bamboo coral and a beautiful halibut seeking a little bit of shelter, and very much, oh, and if you're lucky, you'll see an octopus in there as well, but very much like their southern cousins, the hard corals and the soft corals of the temperate regions. Important habitat for fish and other species. Nature Conservancy put this together, and I think it's great. The that coral reefs may have a value of nearly $10 trillion. More than half of all new cancer drugs are focusing on marine organisms. Coral reefs cover just 1% of the planet, but may be responsible and home for 25% of our marine species. Now, this is not a coral reef species. I'm only presenting it because it's cool, but from the Census of Marine Life, this is the Bob Marley worm. You can see the dreadlocks and all that. And it's also to show that we scientists do have a sense of humor. But the point is, coral reefs, which have so many species, we're still just barely discovering what lives in these complex ecosystems. Very important for coastal protection, which I'll talk about in a moment, tourism, of course, and food production. So coral reefs are so important to our planet, and yet, if you took all the coral reefs in the world, they would barely fill the state of Texas. That's all we got, and really important to protect. But they're not doing so well. They've been described as the most endangered animal on the planet. There are many others, but this is certainly the opinion of some scientists. You can see the slope of that line. This is from the IUCN Red List, that there's a real danger that we will lose most of our corals by the end of this century. Well, my own story is that I went to a marine science camp as a teenager called Sea Camp in the Florida Keys. And I know somebody from the Keys is on the line here. So I know you're familiar with what happened in the Florida Keys. This is what I saw. This is Elkhorn coral, one of the most important reef building corals in the Caribbean. Well, this is 1975. 10 years later, it looked like this, covered in algae and dying. 10 years after that, it looked like this, almost no live coral. 10 years later, and then 2014, you can barely tell there was even a reef there. Today, 80 to 90% of the reefs of the Florida Keys are gone, they're dead. And about 50% of the coral cover in the Caribbean is gone as well. So people like me, we dream of time machines that would take us back to those days, those glory days of coral reefs. It wasn't a DeLorean, but a 53 Buick, or is that a Dodge? It was Cuba that came to my emotional rescue. And this is what I saw. Look at the health of this Elkhorn coral. This is actually better than what I remember as a teenager from the Florida Keys. And this is a barrier reef that goes on for 30 miles along Cuba's southern coast. And you could see the fish packed into those coral stands. Absolutely incredible. And not just Elkhorn coral, but other species like brain coral, the healthiest I've seen in my life. Absolutely gorgeous. So you put them side by side, a fair comparison 40 years later. This is what rescued me emotionally. And it's a real living laboratory. We can really learn from what a real coral reef, a healthy one, looks like. Dr. Hansen mentioned 60 Minutes. They came to me because they wanted to do a piece on coral reefs, and they knew the public wouldn't understand unless they could see what a healthy coral reef looked like. And for the record, I had the hair first because I'm a little older than Anderson. So just write that down. It'll be on the test. So the situation in Cuba, was it an accident of history, or was it strong laws and regulations? And that's what I explore in the book. And it's really a bit of both. Of course, the focus right now is on climate change. That's what we hear about in the news with regard to corals, coral bleaching, which doesn't kill the corals, but certainly weakens them, and they often do die as a result. And we've seen that incredibly in one of the best managed coral reef areas, the Great Barrier Reef off Australia, which has lost half of its corals since 1995 due to back-to-back warming events. And by the way, my students know it was one of their assignments. It's on Netflix, Chasing Coral, which was done by a good friend of mine and colleague. They used time-lapse photography to really show that warming event in the Great Barrier Reef. So Chasing Coral, I highly recommend. I've described corals as the princess and the pea. They pretty much hate everything that we do. They're incredibly sensitive. And the thing is, we are focused on climate, these global threats, but there are local threats as well. And I'm going to talk about those because we're sort of forgetting them in the public discourse. And it really relates to the difference between us and Cuba and the rest of the world. So in the United States, Rachel Carson, I hope you've heard of the book Silent Spring, which ushered in a new awareness of the environment. And a number of years later, this image appeared on the front pages of many newspapers around the country. It outraged people to see that the Cuyahoga River itself was on fire. And there were many instances of pipes with toxic pollution entering our waterways. And who but Richard Milhouse Nixon, a Republican, signed into law the Clean Water Act and many other acts, important environmental legislation. And he established the EPA, he established NOAA. There was this unusual thing called bipartisanship. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but it was actually something that existed in our political system years ago. So the Clean Water Act took us so far. It focused on point source pollution, but the other problem it did not address is non-point source pollution, the stuff that's not coming from pipes. So here's a pop quiz. What is the #1 irrigated crop in the US? Is it corn, sorghum, potatoes? It's turf grass. More than 40 million acres of land in the continental US have some sort of lawn. And we have this addiction to having the greenest lawn on the block. And what do? We fertilize. We fertilize the bejesus out of our lawns. And we usually use too much, and that runs off into our waterways. I love this ad from New Jersey about the overuse of fertilizing. So I took this picture in Ohio when I was speaking to some students there, and I showed it to them. This was during the Gulf oil spill, and the kids were asking me, what can we do to help the Gulf? And I said, you literally can help the Gulf by what you're doing in your own backyard, by not over fertilizing, or kill your lawn, which I don't think is a bad idea. In Cuba, not so many lawns, maybe around the embassies, but lawns are not a big deal down there. So you don't have that runoff from homes. Of course, the big contributor to nutrient pollution, as it's called, the fertilizers, which do the same thing in the water, by the way, as they do on your lawn. They stimulate the growth of plants and algae and cause eutrophication, and that algae has many other negative effects. And you saw that algae overgrowing corals as well. So big ag, industrial ag plays a big role. And if you look at that pink area, more than 44% of the continental US and even a bit of Canada drain into the Mississippi. And as a result, you have this huge area of nutrients and algae growth. You can see the stark contrast. The algae dies and bacteria go to work on it to decompose it. That uses oxygen. And as a result, you have nothing else that can live in there. Fish can't live there. And we have a dead zone the size of New Jersey off of the Mississippi, the mouth of the Mississippi, and many other dead zones around the world, in fact. Well, in Cuba, the situation is different. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, Cuba really went into what they call their special period. It's really an understatement. The Soviet Union pulled out all support, all of the oil exports. You can see from these statistics, manufacturing down 90%, GDP down 35%. People lost a lot of weight, 5 to 25% of their body weight. There was no oil. So to get people around, they built these camellos. You could fit 100, 150 people into one of these things. And this is Nitsa Viapol, the equivalent of Julia Child, had a popular cooking program, but there was so little food. She, on one of her shows, did a recipe of ropa vieja, which is a popular dish, shredded beef, using banana peels. I don't know any of my friends who actually made that recipe, but people were eating all sorts of things. The penalty for killing a cow was 15 to 25 years in prison. And that's how hungry people were during those times. They might risk it. But what happened to agriculture is much different than what you saw in big ag in the United States. They essentially, they couldn't fuel the Russian tractors, which just rusted. And they went back to basically 19th century agriculture using oxen. They had no fertilizers. So essentially, they were forced into organic farming. And so the theory was, with fewer nutrients going into the water and ultimately into the sea, that would be great for coral reefs because they wouldn't be covered with algae growth. And until recently, that was just a theory. But Paul Biermann from University of Vermont started studying Cuban rivers a couple of years ago with the Academy of Sciences and found that the nutrient load of Cuban rivers is much lower than the Mississippi, maybe 25% or less, which is dramatic. Unfortunately, because there's, again, no data from the past, we don't know what the trends are, but that's significant. So the first time we actually know that answer. That period also gave birth to urban farms and organoponicos, as they're called. I did not Photoshop the green on this lettuce. This is organic farming in urban settings. It's the best food you can buy, a little expensive for Cubans, but indeed something very positive. So organic farming, fewer nutrients. There are other things that I think are important to mention. This is the Everglades, where I used to be the co-chair of the Everglades Coalition. And really, land and water are inextricably linked. I don't think there's any better example than the Everglades, this slow-moving sheet flow down from basically where Disney World is now, down through the Florida Keys, through estuaries, beautiful sheet flow. This is Rookery Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, the recipient of that fresh water, and where salt water and fresh water meet. Estuaries, as many of you know, are critical nurseries for marine species, and they depend on that delicate balance of fresh and salt water. But we kind of hated the swamp. We dug, we wanted that water for agriculture and cities. And this is what the Everglades looks like today. So we are engaging in the largest ecosystem restoration in history. This is a graph of salinity in Rookery Bay, which you just saw a slide of. So the thing to notice is that big drop is fresh water going in and taking that estuary from that delicate balance of fresh and salt water to nearly fresh water, which has lethal impacts on the organisms that live there. So it's very ironic. We have basically made fresh water a pollutant by our modification of the landscape at such a large scale. In contrast, in Cuba, Ciénaga de Zapata, the Zapata Swamp, a biosphere reserve and Ramsar site, it's untouched, as are many of the areas around Cuba. Many of these large ecosystems, there has been land modification, but overall, that land-sea interface has not been messed with. But that's not to say they didn't want to mess with that. And there is one example of where they did mess with that. In 1966, Fidel, food was a big issue, and he decided to launch a program of not permitting one drop of water to reach the sea and use that water for agriculture. Now, if you're a marine biologist, this is going to be your expression. Because again, those estuaries depend on a very delicate balance of fresh and salt water. And by choking the fresh water, which they did, it actually affected shrimp populations off the southern coast. But interestingly, some have theorized maybe that actually helped coral reefs because there was less nutrient runoff, even though it was probably small. Again, just a theory. We just don't know. We don't have data for that. This is a report that came out a number of years ago talking about the loss of corals and showing that there has been a 50% decline in the Caribbean since 1970. So the question is, why isn't there coral on the cover of this report? And why is there a parrotfish caught in a net? Parrotfish are really interesting creatures. They actually like to eat coral, which would seem like a bad thing, but what they're doing is they are grazing the algae off that coral and keeping the corals healthy. Now, wait for it. There we go. Okay, and in case you missed that, instant replay. That is parrotfish poop. And I shall tell you that 90% of a parrotfish's day is spent noisily eating coral reefs. It's common to see parrotfish swimming about, nonchalantly emitting a contrail of white sand from their anus, the end product of coral as it is pulverized passing through their digestive system. That sandy fish poop makes up a substantial part of the sandy halo surrounding coral reefs and coral heads. So fair warning, if you find yourself scuba diving and kneeling in sand near a coral reef, it may well have traveled through the gut and anus of a parrotfish to get there. You should feel honored. The problem is we're eating parrotfish around the country. Unfortunately, in Cuba, parrotfish don't sit on the Cuban palate all that well, so they haven't really been hunted that much. The problem is in other parts of the world, including the United States, we think of fish as crops that grow in the ocean, and we don't think of them as a part of the fabric of the ecosystem. Fish have jobs to do, like parrotfish, as you just saw. We also take, this is not a US ship, this is a Russian trawler, but we take tons and tons of fish out of the oceans. And Cuba is still fishing with hook and line. So many of the fish are very healthy and the populations are sustainable. Another animal that enjoys the taste of algae are the long spine sea urchin known as diadema. And in one of the greatest marine pandemics ever recorded, most of them died in the Caribbean in around 1983. So not only were we hunting parrotfish and other algae grazers, we lost diadema. And all the while, we're pumping nutrients into the water, resulting in that die-off that you saw earlier. Side note, but very important, if you recognize that watch cap, you know that that is Jacques Cousteau's watch cap from the Calypso. I have a very short clip to show you.
A fiery dawn finds a complex new mission beginning. As the rediscovery of the world lures Calypso to Cuba, the Caribbean's most intriguing island.
I wish I could show you the whole thing. It's fascinating. They went to Cuba in 1985, and you can see a smiling Jacques Cousteau saying, "The reef more rich than any I have seen in years." This is 1985. This is only a few years after the destruction of much of the coral in the Caribbean. So I was surprised to hear him say that in 1985. He invited Fidel aboard Calypso, and they became friends. And they stayed friends for many years. In fact, this is the Rio summit in 1992. As the story goes, they were posing for a picture of the heads of state, and Fidel grabbed Cousteau and said, "You need to be in this picture too." So I guess he was the head of the oceans. But I brought Bobby Kennedy to Cuba, and a letter from Fidel, he had visited Fidel, really confirmed what many Cuban scientists had told me, that Jacques Cousteau had a huge impact on Fidel's thinking about the oceans. And it's believed that it was borne out in many of Cuba's laws. Cuba's Law 81 of the environment in particular conveys a basic right of society and its citizens, the right to a sound environment. They established 25% ultimately of their waters in protected areas, a very large number. And just in 2019, climate change is in their constitution, dealing with climate change, one of only 10 countries to have done that. Can you imagine the interesting discussions we'd have in the United States trying to change our constitution to put climate change in there? That would be kind of interesting. Marine protected areas are so important. As I said, Cuba established 25%. The United States is about there now. But no take is a very important part of that, not to take any of those fish or any of the organisms there, because you're protecting the entire organism or the entire ecosystem at once. It's an insurance policy. It protects all elements. One example in the US, Papahanaumokuakea, very hard to pronounce, in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. George Bush established it. It was doubled in size by Barack Obama, bipartisanship. And this is a no-take reserve. So this is something that gives me great optimism about Cuba, and something that we're all starting to do. But we lagged Cuba by a couple of decades. Another thing that gives me hope is the use of environmental economics. It used to be free, basically. You could use the environment to dump our waste or to take what we wanted, and there was a blank side of the ledger. There was no cost to that. So the idea of putting an economic value on the services of the environment is very important. World Resources Institute did a study in Belize showing that the importance of coral reefs and mangroves to shoreline protection was more valuable than fisheries and tourism combined. And that's largely because coral reefs reduce wave energy by 97%, incredible number. So if you look at the cost of putting in gray infrastructure, seawalls and the like, versus restoring coral reefs, it's a factor of 15 times cheaper to restore coral reefs. These are the sorts of insights you get from environmental economics. And again, it's written into Cuba's law, a socialist country applying the principles of environmental economics. We hosted several workshops on environmental economics, working with the Cubans to help them fulfill that mandate. There's a study in Palau that shows that the value of a single shark over its lifetime is about $2 million, as opposed to a few hundred on your dinner plate. I brought that guy to Cuba. He paid nearly $10,000 for the chance to take photos of sharks like this. But tourism has two sides to it. It has a danger. Mass tourism has been a complete failure in the Caribbean, and this idea of spring break. Cancun is a poster child. The reefs have largely died. The culture has been severely disrupted. We're getting larger and larger ships that are having terrible environmental impacts on our environment. The Gardens of the Queen is the largest no-take MPA, marine protected area in the Caribbean, and I heard about the enforcement ship, and this is in my mind what I imagined. This is the enforcement vessel for the Gardens of the Queen. You can walk faster than it can go. But the real enforcement comes from people like Elsa. She's a housekeeper on a liveaboard boat. Her economic future depends on the environment being healthy. So you're building in the right incentives of people to protect the environment, economic incentives, and they're the ones that are the stewards. We've been doing work in the Isle of Youth, which is actually the 7th largest island in the Caribbean, but it's kind of hidden down there under the mothership of Cuba. It's gorgeous. It is a beautiful island, and we've been working in a little town called Cocodrilo, which means crocodile, with lovely people. And the idea is Cuba hasn't received that tsunami of mass tourism yet. It does exist in some areas, but visitors will pay a premium for an authentic experience. And if we can keep tourism at a small scale, like the use of bed and breakfasts in Cuba, casa particular, it is a much better way to get to know the Cuban people. It keeps the resources in the communities, and most important, it provides the incentives for all those people not to exploit their reefs and other natural areas, but to protect them. And here is the first bed and breakfast in Cocodrilo. It's also a dive center, which means when you go to sleep, you have regulators hanging over your head. And I happen to be the very first American to sleep there. And they didn't have screens yet, so I also donated a lot of blood to the local mosquito population. I don't have time to talk about it. We did talk about parrotfish poop, but if somebody asks me about whale poop, I will gladly tell them why that's important to environmental economics as well. So my point is, if we can take care of those local threats, then we're giving our reefs an advantage, a leg up, more resilience to those global threats. And, you know, we're not in a good situation right now. You can see all of these bleaching events, the temperature going up. Even if we can stabilize our water temperatures, our carbon emissions, it's predicted we'll probably lose 70 to 90% of our corals by the end of this century, which is pretty sad. So the focus has moved more to triage. looking at healthy reefs that have the best chance of survival, that have a chance to repopulate the degraded reefs downstream. And there was a study done in 2018, you can ignore the colors on this graph, picking 50 of those areas that have the best chance of survival around the world. Now, if we just focus on the Caribbean and the Bahamas, look at this. 5 of the 50 areas in the world are in Cuban waters. So that is a huge reason to protect Cuba and help Cuba, which is already in the process of protecting it, to work with Cuban scientists to protect their reefs. There are other methods going on, selective breeding, genetic modification of corals to make them more resilient, and of course, coral restoration, replanting corals, although you're replanting them into the same hot water, but still, these also provide hope. Marine science and conservation is considered one of the most successful areas of collaboration. I think scientists succeeded where diplomats failed. I don't have time to go into all of the politics that have taken place, but it's been significant because the very first memoranda of understanding after relations started to normalize, the very first agreements between Cuba and the US focused on the oceans. That's exciting and that's cool. And we had government to government talks, and that gives me hope. And I'll close by saying that I'm involved in a journey to all 50 states. This is Barrow, Alaska, the US Virgin Islands, talking to kids about the oceans, and the middle of the country, Kansas. I'm learning a lot from these kids, and I see that they're great stewards. Our Cuban students as well, working with us on workshops, they care. I call my Johns Hopkins students the new ocean doctors. I really feel like the next generation is ready to go, and they give me great hope. So thank you very much.
Dr. Guggenheim, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation of the work that you're doing. And I want to remind our viewers and our listeners that you can ask a question for Dr. Guggenheim in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. So feel free. I know it takes usually a second to write a question if you're doing that right now. And to get us started, we've only got about 12 minutes. You know I'm going to ask about whale poop since you mentioned it. So can you tell us a little bit more about the project that you did involving whale poop, please?
I can. So one of our guest speakers was Ralph Shami from the International Monetary Fund for my ocean stewardship class. And he got fascinated by whales and calculated how much carbon a whale could sequester and what the value of that was. It's not just the mass of the whale itself, it's all the whale poop that is a whale is putting into fairly barren parts of the ocean and stimulating the growth of phytoplankton, and which is pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And a single whale could be worth $3 million just with regard to carbon, nothing else. And if you think about the size of the populations that we used to have, that's a big number, a big amount of carbon. And what's important is from the IMF, he's developed important economic models. So as a result of a student project, we are now working with the state of Florida, with Rookery Bay that you saw me present, on a project that really flips the board. It's, instead of carbon being a cost, carbon becomes an investment. The idea is to bring outside private investment into public lands to defer, if not eliminate, the cost of restoration of the Everglades. That's really exciting. especially because, with the IMF, again, we have strong economic models building a carbon exchange, and it's all because whales poop.
That's excellent. Thank you for that explanation. My next question I have is with respect to working in Cuba. So I'm fascinated by your work in Cuba from a cultural perspective. Could you maybe summarize for me from a cultural perspective, what is the greatest challenge of working in Cuba, but also maybe what is the greatest blessing of working in Cuba as an environmental scientist?
Let me start with the blessing, and I have two. Cuban people are warm and wonderful and welcoming, and there's no divide on the environment as we have in our country, in the United States. Everybody cares about the environment. It's something that everybody rallies around. In terms of challenges, it's tragic for me to see very, very bright people not being able to move forward in their careers, whether it's young people who are tattoo artists or singers or scientists. So many people are leaving the country. There's an enormous brain drain, and I think that's tragic because these are really gifted people and a joy to work with.
Thank you for that analysis. I think that is an interesting way to view it. And I think we have some students in our program that are interested in exploring working in Cuba further as we're getting some questions in. We have a question here. Are there any methods used to physically remove abundant amounts of algae from the water at small scales in coral reefs? And we could add to that physically or even chemically remove algae from the water in small scales.
As far as I know, there are not. I just may not know of something that may exist, but the best cure for something like that is a healthy ecosystem. And for example, I didn't have time to present it, but I was going to present information on lionfish, which have invaded all through. It's a Indo-Pacific species that has made its way all the way from New England down to South America, including Cuba, and they're wreaking havoc. But the best chance, of getting rid of lionfish, there's not enough divers to kill them all. The best chance is a healthy ecosystem with healthy predators. So they're actually trying to teach sharks and groupers that lionfish are quite tasty, and they will take lionfish from a spear. The idea is to teach them to take them from elsewhere. So back to algae, I really feel like we need the grazers of algae. We need to restore the fish and the other animals into that ecosystem to keep algae in check.
So our next question actually kind of piggybacks on that. And this is coming from Sophie. Sophie writes, it's my understanding that shallow water coral reefs rely on photosynthesis from the symbiotic zooxanthellae, limiting them to waters of a particular depth with the right level of sunlight penetration. So she asks, are the healthy reefs that you've encountered in Cuba, are they threatened by rising sea levels? And to what extent could restoration or transplantation help mitigate that?
So far, we haven't seen the evidence that that's a problem yet. A lot of these are shallow water, but the water is very clear, and there's many of these species are fairly deep, down 30, 40, 50 feet down, many of these species, believe it or not. The sad part about this is that the water's hot even at that depth. I was diving a number of years ago. I was at 30 feet and the water temperature was 87 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's hot water. We are even seeing bleaching at 100 feet in Cuba. The difference is by November or so, that bleaching is gone. The zooxanthellae, as you mentioned, the symbiotic algae return, and they're doing fine. That's down at about 100 feet. So you're still having photosynthetic corals pretty deep in the water. And it's those corals we probably know least about, the twilight zone, as they call it.
Thank you. So Theodore has a question that's a little bit more on the enforcement side of things. So he saw a special recently on how the protected fish ecosystem was critical in helping coral reefs in the South Pacific recover from the devastating heat wave of 2015 and 16. Do you believe Cuba's monitoring and enforcement with actual boats is sufficient? And is anyone working on this issue and tracking the number of illegal fishing being caught from year to year in terms of, are they quantifying this as their data?
Really important question. And the answer is that probably 20% of the protected areas are really well managed and enforced in Cuba. That's why I'm hammering so much on the principle of environmental economics and trying to get local populations to do a lot of that enforcement themselves. In the Isle of Youth, there's an area that has exactly the same protections as Gardens of the Queen. It's called Punta Frances. It's beautiful. You may have seen the picture of the trunkfish nibbling on a jellyfish in the video. That's Isle of Youth. But it's a protected area, but fishing vessels, you don't have outside or independent fishermen coming into those areas. What you have are the commercial fishing fleet of Cuba coming in and crossing the boundary into the protected area. So it's a very weird situation. You've got the Ministry of Food versus the Ministry of the Environment. But the local enforcement people have no boat at all. And that is a problem with multiple dimensions to it, as you can imagine. But it's a great question. We have to be really creative when it comes to enforcement. And the Cubans themselves will tell you probably only 20% of their protected areas have good enforcement. Fortunately, it's not like Florida where you have to it's like a video game trying to avoid boats. I've piloted a boat and driven for 3 hours without seeing another boat. So there's not so many boats that you've got to patrol and protect against.
Another question here coming from a little bit of a different perspective. So Maddie is an Iowa native, and a lot of her interest in environmental science is coming from harm that runoff is causing.
Yeah.
Do you have any experience or any recommendations in approaching sustainable agricultural practices in terms of like recommendations or how to engage, I guess, farmers and producers without offending them? Because I know it can be somewhat of a sensitive topic.
I personally don't have that experience. One of my student projects dealt with chicken farms around the Chesapeake Bay, and I thought their idea was great. Chicken farms are exempt from some of the regulations that affect things like hog farms and others that they're strictly regulated about dumping waste into the water. So you got to be more creative. And what they came up with an idea of bringing these farmers together and doing something with all of that waste. They call it poultry litter, by the way, which is a funny euphemism. So, this would be something, again, environmental economics to give them some value for something that would otherwise be a waste product. There are a lot of regulations regarding big ag and farming and runoff. And I think runoff is one of the biggest problems, but also I think the marketplace can also drive a lot of this stuff. I always talk about this with regard to seafood. We have the two most potent weapons or tools in our purses and pockets, our smartphones and our wallets. And we can, ask a lot of annoying questions about where our food is coming from. And we can, there's a great app called Seafood Watch by the Monterey Bay Aquarium. You can really inform yourself. and the market responds. The people at the restaurant or at the grocery store are going to, eventually hear that and respond to that. They want to sell you some fish. And I think the same goes for your produce and other things. As the market demands more organic food, then the hope is that the farms will respond. But again, personally, I have not done a one-to-one with people in some of those farms, but it's a great question.
Thank you for that. And since we're at 2 o'clock, I'm not going to take any more questions, but I do want, there's a bunch of questions related to travel to Cuba. So I just want to kind of do a general statement with respect to our environmental science and policy program. We are working with Dr. Guggenheim to coordinate a future field course to Cuba in the future. So expect news on that coming eventually. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah.
And do feel free to reach out to Dr. Guggenheim. His bio and email are on the ESP faculty website. And I want to thank you for your, Dr. Guggenheim, for your wonderful presentation and stunning imagery and wonderful sense of humor. It's a most entertaining seminar. And thank our viewers too for joining us as well. And a reminder too that I think this is actually our last seminar for the fall, but we will resume again in the springtime. So thank you for joining us for our Sustainable Solutions Speaker Series this season.
Thank
And
you.
have a good rest of your day, everyone.